You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 23rd of April 2025 on Monocle Radio.
India considers its response to a terror attack in Kashmir. Would you take a holiday in Iraq? And how tarnished is any given Oscar by the revelation that those who awarded it may not have seen the film? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Lynne O'Donnell and Nina dos Santos will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series will recall arguably the greatest marketing mishap in modern history. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Lynne O'Donnell, columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, and Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, Nina, you first of all have recently been in Europe, specifically France, where you have been talking to vexed vintners.
That's right, in the Bordeaux region, the most famous region of France. They were really worried about the impact of these trade tariffs. So I was there just, in fact, before the EU announced its countermeasures. And there was a huge amount of nervousness that the EU would go for a bourbon whiskey in America if they were to have imposed their own counter tariffs on that, or at least promised to. America had promised to retaliate with tariffs in the hundreds of percentage points. And there was some real nervousness by European alcohol producers that might happen. Now, I think, speaking to some of these Bordeaux Chateau owners, what they're also nervous about is a drop-off in tourism between the United States and France.
See, I would have hoped that French winemakers would have taken a more characteristically French and robust attitude to the American
glass half empty attitude?
Or no, basically just said, and I'm not going to attempt to do the accent, but basically just said, if Americans want to condemn themselves to Californian Zinfandel, see if we care.
There was a bit of that, actually, as you'd imagine.
There we go.
Put a bottle of that with some freedom fries, I suppose, is where we're going back to.
Exactly. And Lynne, by way of moving seamlessly along, you have recently been in the United States. Not that I imagine you would have drunk any Californians in Fandel, because why would anybody, unless they were at a low-rent book launch and had it pressed into their hands in a small plastic cup?
Which I didn't mind at all, to be honest with you. Press away.
Which parts of the US were you in?
I ranged quite widely. I started in Arizona, then went to DC, New York and Pennsylvania.
And did you find it a country seething with uncertainty and paranoia or not?
No, I found trauma, to be honest with you. Arizona, of course, Trump and God country, and then to DC and New York, which are quite the opposite, and to Pennsylvania, which is the most purple state in the United States. A lot of reeling, except in Arizona, they weren't reeling. It was before Liberation Day that I was there, but after that, it was people in DC worried about their jobs, a lot of unemployment, a lot of arbitrary sacking there. New York, they just hate Trump anyway. Couldn't find a MAGA hat. I have a provocative friend in Melbourne who wanted a MAGA hat. I couldn't find one.
You were looking in the wrong city.
I was indeed. I was even told, no, we don't have those here, lady.
Well, I mean, I'm impressed that you asked. We will start in India, which is pondering a response to yesterday's terror attack in Kashmir. At least 26 people were killed when 4 gunmen opened fire on a group of mostly Indian tourists visiting Pahalgam. Responsibility for the massacre has been claimed by a hitherto little heralded Islamist group called the Resistance Front, or TRF, believed in some circles to be an offshoot of Lashkar-e-Taiba, the better-known Pakistani group most infamous for its involvement in the 2008 terror attacks on Mumbai, which left at least 175 people dead. TRF's statement pronounced vexation with India's granting of Kashmiri residency permits to people from outside the region. Lynne, first of all, India, unsurprisingly and possibly not unreasonably, is promising what it called a loud and clear response. But what could that actually look like?
Well, it could look like it did a few years ago with missiles being fired into Pakistani territory in retaliation. I don't think there is much doubt that there is a link with LET, the Lashkar-e-Taiba that you mentioned, and Lashkar-e-Taiba has links with Pakistan's secret agency, intelligence agency, the ISI. And it comes after comments by the Chief of Staff of the Army, Munir, that enemies are in our sights, and it also coincided with the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance's visit to India, and all of these things really are put together. India hasn't said anything yet about the Kashmiri resistance claim of responsibility, but I think, all compass points are going to point to Pakistan, and I think retaliation will be on the cards. It has to be.
I mean, that being the case, Nina, how do we pass Pakistan's statement? They said they were concerned by the attack, but they have not said, at least so far as I've been able to discover, that they condemned the attack. They did say we reject terrorism in all forms everywhere, but did not get into the specifics about this particular one, which is a bit weird when you consider how easy it would be for Pakistan to say, yeah, this is absolutely terrible, we condemn it, nothing to do with us, etc.
Yeah, it feels like a very lukewarm statement, doesn't it, given the severity of the attacks and the fact that 26 tourists have lost their lives here, largely men from India, and also that this is the worst attack since back in 2008 when you saw the Mumbai terror attack. So in terms of the importance of it for India, it's clearly very important, and the proportionality of the statement from Pakistan obviously doesn't feel like it's there quite yet, does it? It speaks to obviously the tense relationships politically between India and Pakistan at this time, but also probably one of the reasons why the statement is quite weak from Pakistan is the fact that this, one could argue, stems back to the 2019 decision by Narendra Modi to row back the autonomy of this largely Muslim part of a region that both Pakistan and India both claim. It was a flashpoint up until recently, and things had sort of calmed down, and then this nascent tourism industry had boomed. But in 2019, Modi and his government decided to split it into two regions. And as you pointed out, that meant that people from the rest of India could then start to move in.
I mean, the two countries, Lynne, have gone to war over Kashmir before. There's been any number of minor flare-ups over Kashmir. The two countries are also, of course, both nuclear armed. How great is the danger that this does escalate into something approaching a full-scale conflict between Pakistan and India? And I guess the key question there is that something that either of them would actually want?
I don't think so. Pakistan would be the big loser, I think. India is the bigger power in the region. But Pakistan is, it strikes me as one of those countries that needs an enemy, and focusing national enmity on India is a way of deflecting attention from the inadequacies of governance inside Pakistan.
That does go both ways in this particular circumstance.
In this particular circumstance, maybe, but generally when you go to India, they're not as focused on Pakistan as the Pakistanis are overwhelmingly on India. I think this is a serious escalation, I think, in the tensions between, as you say, two nuclear-armed enemies, but India is the bigger enemy of Pakistan than Pakistan is of India, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, there will be retaliation, but I don't think either side would want it to go as far as a nuclear attack. There'll be a lot of, I think we'll see sabre rattling in coming weeks. And Vance has just said that the relationship between India and the United States will be the pivotal relationship of the 21st century. So I think the Trump administration will have India's back on this.
That being the case, Nina, is there a danger of hubris descending upon Narendra Modi? Because if we live in a world, as we now appear to do, where the United States is of the view that the great powers can do as they like, and there has been a lot of concern that China might seize this moment to settle what it regards as the unfinished matter of Taiwan, is there possibly a temptation for Modi to think, well, when am I going to get a better opportunity to settle Kashmir once and for all?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And especially considering, as I said, that move to, change the rules in those territories of, Kashmir, splitting them into two, this particular part of Kashmir, splitting them into two different places and allowing Indian citizens to then move in, redresses that balance. And that happened just before the pandemic, right? And it didn't gain a huge amount of international attention as a result. So you're right, whenever there's a sort of news vacuum, there is a temptation for leaders, especially if they've been in office a long time. They got through the last election, but were given a bit of a bloody nose. It could be, as Lynne was just saying, an opportunity for some form of retaliation, though I suspect the United States would caution very heavily against anything particularly draconian.
Well, to the United States now, and the depressing possibility that one of the best means of understanding its current trajectory is reading the works of its foremost historian of authoritarianism. In Timothy Snyder's book On Tyranny, his very first prescription for resisting it is do not obey in advance. Depressingly, however, certain American institutions appear to be doing exactly that. Some universities, several prominent law firms, and certain media outlets. Bill Owens, the long-serving executive producer of 60 Minutes on CBS, has quit, claiming he was no longer permitted to act independently. Lynne, the backdrop to this, of course, is Donald Trump's pending lawsuit over 60 Minutes election campaign interview with Kamala Harris. Donald Trump, of course, being the world's sorest winner. To render this in the colloquial Australian, why does 60 Minutes not just tell him to get stuffed?
The 60 Minutes is owned by CBS, which is, has to be enslaved to the Trump White House if it wants to continue in business. He's already threatened its license. There's also a very big deal on the table in a takeover or merger with another media company that needs regulatory authorization or approval, and that also comes to Trump. So, as with everything, it comes down to power and money, and no journalist in the world can work for any organisation without working for whoever is paying them, whoever signs the checks. And I think that if Bill Owens feels that he can no longer do the job in the way that he wants to do it, he's done the honourable thing with great integrity and left and shone a light on basically the practices of his employer.
I mean, should the media outlets, and this may be an optimistic assessment, Nina, be more worried about losing the loyalty of their readers, listeners and viewers if they are seen to capitulate to the government of the day?
Well, especially if it's a big show like CBS 60 Minutes, which is the sort of last one of those big interview investigative shows. If the editor of that own programme says they have no confidence in the independence of that particular programme, you've got a real problem, because appointment of view television all over the world is dying a death. People want to see things in the immediate. They want to see things on YouTube. The distribution model of these big US cable networks is being completely upended. So, it's not surprising that we see some of the big names jump ship when they feel that, the management isn't behind this model anymore. But it's a very different prospect if you're seeing also the management capitulate to, autocratic tendencies, perhaps, in a country like the United States, where, by the way, the First Amendment right is sacrosanct, not just to journalists, not just to politicians, but to all Americans. So it's really worrying.
Well, though it does appear, Lynne, that Americans often seem to think the First Amendment is sacrosanct when it applies to people who happen to agree with them, arguably less so when applied to people who don't. But are we seeing the American media? Certainly it's great, self-important, verging on pompous bastions revealed as something of a paper tiger, because before Trump was inaugurated, or just after, but early in this regime, we did see the leak of that edict issued about the Washington Post's future direction on its op-ed pages. The Washington Post, of course, the newspaper which never tires of reminding people that it once brought down a corrupt and crooked president.
And nor should it, I guess. It's a pretty dull newspaper, really. We once were great. A lot of people have jumped ship from the Washington Post as well, as we know, over the last few months. But I think that there's been more hubris in that than we are seeing at 60 Minutes. Journalists who have complained that articles they wrote criticising the owner of the newspaper were not run, and so I'm leaving. Well, what did you expect? You're just pushing the envelope there. This guy signs your paycheck, So, but I think the 60 Minutes thing is a little bit more, Trump's claim that there was a nefarious editing of the Kamala Harris pre-election interview is really just, it's lies, really. It's either lies or a tacit will to misunderstand the way television and radio and interviews, even, print interviews work. Mm-hmm. If you ran absolutely everything, you'd never get anything else in,
And this is a really important point, because having spent 20 odd years working for US networks and a smaller amount of time working for UK outlets, the US networks believe very often that if they get it right, they will fight it right to the end. And so when you're seeing big networks like, for instance, Disney, which owns ABC, settle a lawsuit under similar sort of situation, CBS, 60 Minutes, editor resigning because CBS might settle a similar sort of lawsuit that they still claim is spurious, you've got a bit of a problem, because my recollection of working for all of these types of networks is that if the facts are accurate, they should be allowed to speak for themselves. So it could be quite an important moment, I think, in terms of, journalistic confidence in America.
I mean, on that, Nina, and this is a more bleak analysis of the situation, has President Trump and those around him possibly calculated correctly that the overwhelming majority of Americans are simply uninterested in serious media? They don't care about it. They don't read it. They don't watch it. What they actually want is to be able to, participate in the great pantomime that they have been staging for the last decade.
Yeah, he certainly cottoned on to the fact that this is an industry in decline. It's an industry in decline where its business model has been in decline for a very long time, and the top management hasn't been embracing new technologies. They haven't actually been leading the charge on new novel ways of capturing audiences. Netflix came out of nowhere. It didn't have a streaming platform, but some of the huge US networks we've just mentioned now have had, brand equity with generations of viewers, and they haven't really been able to, turn that into something that's a new and refreshing product that young viewers want to stay with them with. The average age of your viewer of CBS 60 Minutes is quite elderly, similar for NBC, the competitor, who I once worked for. I think audiences, they're older, the younger people, they want to watch stuff on YouTube very often. And this is, to the detriment of our democracy. They want to watch self-affirming programs, and Donald Trump is ultimately a self-affirming president, right? So I'm not surprised he's taking this tack, and he's also a business person. He's realised this is a business that is on its knees. It's quite worrying, really.
Well, to Iraq, a decision which Iraq very much hopes tourists will begin to make. Efforts are apparently afoot to entice travellers to visit a country which in recent decades has rather struggled for the tourist dollar for reasons requiring no reiteration. But it is not as obviously preposterous a proposition as it might sound. If it is, or would ever be, the case that the mayhem wrought by assorted militia groups has been reduced to a dull roar, Iraq has much to offer. It is the literal cradle of civilization, home of the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians et al., and among the more recent historical rubble are fully 12,000 UNESCO-listed heritage sites, not even including Saddam Hussein's ghastly palaces. Lynne, you have reported from Iraq. I suspect you've been there rather more recently than I have, which, heaven help me, was 20 years ago in Basra, which I sincerely hope has improved since then. But would you have any hot Iraq travel tips?
Well, no, to be honest with you. It's been quite a while since I was there as well, and the violence wasn't over when I was there. I think that Iraq is feeling comfortable enough to invite tourists to come is a wonderful thing. I don't know whether I would go on a pilgrimage to Kabul because that seems to be too easy a target of sectarian violence.
It has been before, certainly.
Indeed, and an easy soft target as well, I'm afraid, at particular times of the year. But I think that when, and look at Kashmir, millions of tourists who would be mostly Indian have felt comfortable enough to go there in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's just screamed to an awful and tragic halt. And the people who are hurt most by that are the people who make a living from the tourist industry. And tourism is good. I mean, I hate coaches on the streets of any city that I live in, big, rumbly, noisy buses. But I do think that it's wonderful that people want to travel around the world and look at other cultures and civilizations and eat other foods and, learn other languages. And that war and violence prevents that in many places, I think is awful.
I can at least vouch for the food in Iraq. The seafood is actually genuinely especially good, even by the river in Baghdad. They do incredible things with carp. Nina, would you be tempted by an Iraqi holiday just yet?
Not if carp's on the menu. Can't eat any river fish apart from trout, says the old trout. No, I think I've always wanted to go to Iraq. I've gone right to the border between Syria and Iraq and never actually got the chance to cross over. I have fond memories of going to visit Palmyra during the Arab Spring. And then, I now think back to, thank goodness, I got a chance to see that before. Obviously, parts of it were blown to smithereens. And there are parts of the world I would really love to go and see, but I suspect probably I won't get a chance to. Yemen, for instance. Love to see the frankincense trees and some of the archaeology in Yemen. And also China. I've written a lot of pieces about transnational repression, but I don't know how comfortable I'd be going to parts of China, mainland China. Even Hong Kong now has seen a drop-off in people visiting it. And I suppose the last thing to consider is, the 17% decline in tourists from Western Europe to the United States, because we're seeing, anecdotally, all these sort of stories of people potentially being detained for whichever reason arbitrarily by heavy-handed US border guards and put into detention centres and deported, as I said before, completely arbitrarily. And that's putting a lot of tourists off going to visit the US.
I mean, Lynne, you must have had the conversations, because I certainly have, when people ask about, somewhat rickety places that you may have reported from and said, I'd be quite keen to go because I'd just be curious and it seems like an interesting country. What do you tell them, or what have you told them?
Well, I guess it depends on which part of the world you're talking about.
If you talk about somewhere like Afghanistan, for example...
Don't go. I mean, why would you go there? I mean, the women are locked in their homes. Why would you go and get... And there are something like 9,000 surveillance cameras, the BBC report. We knew that the Chinese were helping them with surveillance. Now they've helped. Why would you go and encourage that, But are you always necessarily encouraging the regime when you go to a place? Is not part of it that thing you were talking about you travel the world, you meet people, there's an exchange of ideas and common humanity and so forth. And Afghanistan is, of course, an extremely beautiful country. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so.
You may have been there too long.
Yeah,
Lynne.
maybe, yeah.
I have fond recollections of the drive from Jalalabad to Kabul. It's glorious.
A lot of places, I'm being facetious, a lot of places are beautiful. But no, I think that there are places that I would put off the map in order not to signal my approval of the regime. In countries like China, for instance, I hope that I don't ever have to go to China again. I lived there for more than a decade, as you know, because everything is controlled by the ruling party. In Afghanistan now, everything is controlled by the Taliban. And so people who naively say, I'm going to go on a package tour to Afghanistan and we're not going to benefit the Taliban they're idiots if they think that that's the case. And the same with China, the same with the junta in Myanmar, for instance. So I think that we do have to be picky, judicious, But why not? I have a friend who is bound to a wheelchair with MS who went to Uzbekistan last year. What a wonderful and brave thing to do, to go to places like Samarkand. I would encourage that. But no, Afghanistan, you're an idiot if you go.
Nina, what do you think? Are there places that, even if they were broadly fairly safe, you just wouldn't go because you didn't wish to be contributing to the, I guess, economy of a country run by objectionable people?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is that the list is getting longer because there's more autocrats. Or I used to spend an awful lot of time in Turkey, covering elections in Turkey, and met Erdogan, met members of his government that seemed to be quite sort of open at the start when they came into office. And now even that country is becoming more and more autocratic. And Turkey relies hugely on tourism,
Indeed.
Foreign exchange. So I think the list is getting shorter. I think the question is there are some countries that are more autocratic that realise the benefit of tourism, though, and they don't interfere too much with the tourists. The issue I have is war tourism. I find it extremely distasteful. We saw a lot of this during the Ukraine war, didn't we, when there were lots of people who decided they wanted to turn up, and YouTubers turning up in parts of Ukraine, and getting as close as they could to the front line. It felt a bit sickening. It's one thing places like Sarajevo, generations on, trying to retell the story of the Balkan Wars. It's a whole other thing when there are live wars going on and people are suffering.
Well, to the Oscars now, and what appears a perplexing edict handed down by the overlords thereof, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. They have decreed that henceforth all Academy members, i.e. the people who decide who gets to clutch a golden statue and make a boring speech, will actually have to watch all nominated films in each category in order to be able to vote. This has prompted, as might be expected, an amount of bemusement and ribald speculation vis-à-vis the criteria by which Academy members had been arriving at their decisions, whether vibes, flips of coin, the chimpanzee and dartboard technique, or soliciting bags of used banknotes left in designated Greyhound station lockers. Lynne, how aghast are you to discover that the people I love this story, that the people who vote on Oscars may not actually have sat through all the nominated movies?
Well, I guess there's two reactions. They're either totally disingenuous and have already made up their mind because their mate directed or acted in something, or they are totally discerning and they know that some of it's crap, and why waste their time?
Well, see, this is what I think. I mean, how outraged do you need it? Would it be outrageous, for example, if somebody watched, I don't know, the first 10 minutes of something and just decided, no, this is cobblers, I'm not sitting through this. This is the justification that critics often advance when accused of not having consumed the full work. You don't need to eat a whole egg to know it's rotten.
Well, look, people in TV only watch the first 30 seconds of people's show reels. So,
Are you speaking from embittered experience?
No, but I'm talking about how you've got earlier on the show, we were talking about 60 minutes worth of programming. To get people to sit through 60 minutes, CBS's 60 minutes, requires one heck of a story, right? And lots of those packages on CBS 60 Minutes have won awards, and I'm sure, hopefully, that the judges have sat through the full 60 minutes. That's the point I'm making. But I think it's a whole different ballgame when you're talking about the entertainment industry, for the reason that Lynne mentioned, because it's such an inside circuit. You look at, for instance, the Me Too scandal and the Harvey Weinstein issues. Supposedly nobody knew about that until finally it was blown out into the open by the written press.
At which it emerged that everybody knew about it.
At which it emerged that everybody knew about it and nobody said much about it. So I think the issue you're seeing here is that there's a lot riding on some of these films. There's a lot of lobbying. There's a lot of interpersonal networks between agents and movie theatres and so on and so forth. And I think that's probably why these decisions are sort of pre-made. But I was quite outraged myself, and I don't get a chance to watch anywhere near as many films as I would like to because I just don't have time. So I'm fully guilty of the first 10 minutes, and if it's crap, I'll turn it off.
See, I sympathise with the errant awarders, Lynne, because I do tend to think that most movies, certainly most modern films, are either or both boring and silly. But the reason I like this story is that I came up as a rock journalist, a field which, as you may imagine, Lynne is replete with stories of journalists filing reviews of gigs they may not actually have attended, albums which they may not ever actually have possessed. I was wondering if in your field, i.e. in foreign correspondentry, there's the equivalent, isn't there? These are the reporters known for filing from the location derisively referred to as Mahogany Ridge, i.e. the hotel bar.
There was a friend of mine years ago told me a story about how we were working together at Reuters, and he'd been in some awful place in violence-racked place in Africa, and one of the British newspaper correspondents had won an award, and they were at a bar together there, and he said to him, "That's amazing, congratulations." And he said, "Well, all I did was take the Reuters copy and add adjectives."
God, that's so depressing.
I've got some guesses as to who that might have been as well. Nina, have you ever known the like, or have you ever been tempted? Because the reason I can sit here and swear...
Tempted to do what? Many things.
Just sort of phone it in. Because the reason I can sit here and swear that I never once bilked the readers of Melody Maker like this, like I never reviewed a gig I didn't actually go to, may have left a few before the encores, but there was one of my colleagues who was due to review a show. It was cold and rainy outside. There was something good on television. He was a bit hungover. He just thought, God, who'll ever know? Filed a review of the piece, and it later emerged after it had gone to print that the gig had never actually happened because the drummer had fallen off his motorbike on the way to the show and broken his leg.
That's hilarious. Unfortunate for your colleague.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in today's day and age, you'd be totally outed by the internet. No, I grew up in the US news mould after the Jason Blair scandal at the New York Times. You remember, where there were a lot of articles that had been invented. So it is absolutely verboten to invent quotes, invent people, invent places. They're very, very thorough about that. And it's something I suppose I'll go to my journalistic deathbed with. I do not invent or assume, because that's when you come unstuck.
Well, indeed so. And on that exemplary note, Nina dos Santos and Lynne O'Donnell, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical lecture recalls the moment that one corporate behemoth decided that overwhelming market dominance simply wasn't enough. The human urge to fix that which is not broken is in some respects commendable, and in many more probably inexorable. Our progress from swamps to land to caves to listening to podcasts has been spurred by our irrepressible desire to improve. Certain of our hominid cousins, by way of counterpoint, decided at some point along the way that they were fine with trees and bananas and whatnot, and maybe your attention is here drawn to the awesome panorama of human misery. They weren't wrong, but they lacked ambition. There are few more stark demonstrations of how impossible we as a species find it not to tinker with, literally, a winning formula than the launch on April 23rd, 1985 of New Coke. By way of considering the scale of the folly, it is instructive to imagine, as it very often is at moments of inexplicable hubris, the meeting, which in this particular instance may have gone something like this.
Lads, we, the Coca-Cola Corporation, manufacture what may be the single most popular product ever brought to market. Just last year, for example, i.e. 1984, and the composer of this lecture checked because he's good like that, we creamed $559 million in profits. So I reckon, steady as she goes, let's not be greedy.
Or, now hear me out, we could tweak our headline drink so it tastes a bit more like our main competitor and risk losing the loyal customers we have in pursuit of new ones who may not be interested.
Righto, let's do that. What could go wrong?
Aficionados of inexplicable hubris may also enjoy the sentence with which Coca-Cola led off the internal memo outlining the project.
In its size, scope and boldness, it is not unlike the Allied invasion of Europe in 1944.
Righto. In fairness to the Coca-Cola Corp brains trust of the mid-1980s, Coca-Cola's great rival, Pepsi-Cola, had been catching up, if not exactly nipping at Coke's heels, then raising dust in the distance. Pepsi had done this in part with an ingenious marketing campaign in which members of the public, many of them professed Coke loyalists, were asked to participate in a blind taste challenge.
Coca-Cola says it's the real thing. But Pepsi-Cola believes that when it comes to colas, the only real thing is taste. That's why the Pepsi Challenge has been asking thousands of people across the country to let their own taste decide. And the fact is, nationwide, more people prefer the taste of Pepsi over Coca-Cola.
Though the taste tests were hardly conducted under laboratory conditions and their adherence to the rigours of scientific method was debatable, they worked sufficiently to spook Coca-Cola into believing that their near-century-old recipe might have drifted from fashion. Coca-Cola brewed up a sweeter variation on their familiar drink and tested it extensively, inviting 200,000 people to take a sip. Like that.
Hi, we're New Edition, and we're here to introduce the great new taste of Coca-Cola, the taste of today.
Confident that they had seized the mood of the moment, Coca-Cola unleashed their new variant.
There's never been a better taste. There's never been a better Coke. Introducing the greatest taste discovery in 100 years. Introducing the new taste of Coca-Cola.
It prompted quite the ballyhoo.
Also ahead tonight on INN, for nearly a century, Coca-Cola has had the same distinctive taste. Well, hold on to your hats. It's being changed.
This is the first can of the new product, which will replace regular Coke around the world. It was delivered by Singing Robot.
It's a kick. It's a...
Sure, why not? News media was as happy then as it is now to flam up a story which was essentially a press release, and delighted advertising agencies were furnished with the kind of budgets which allowed Pepsi to have their drink shilled by such wholesome entertainers as while Coca-Cola stuck with such righteous, upstanding family men as
Attention Pepsi drinkers, introducing the new taste of Coca-Cola, the best Coca-Cola ever. That's all I'm going to say. In fact, that's all I have to say.
If the celebrity endorsements of both rivals aged badly, some of Pepsi's responses to Coke's manoeuvre endure as genuinely witty.
I stuck with them through 3 wars and a couple of dust storms, but this is too much. Guess something big made them change.
Right, big.
Right big. Pepsi, the choice of a new generation.
Still could have.
The idea that new Coke flopped in the shops is a bit of an urban myth. It sold fine, and people liked it.
I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony.
But new Coke did, as many things do in the United States, become the subject of a culture war bun fight whose front lines roughly mapped those of the Civil War fought 120 years previously. Coca-Cola was originally concocted in Atlanta by a Confederate cavalry officer. Some in the South seethed at this fresh capitulation to the Yankees in the form of New York-based Pepsi. And if there is anything that makes news media even happier than acting as dutiful midwife to corporate publicity stunts, it is foregrounding the fulminations of cranks and dingbats who would be ignored in or thrown out of any bar full of broadly normal people. In this case, a star was made of one Gay Mullins, self-appointed chair of Old Cola Drinkers of America, who led his seething legions in fervid revolt against mild inconvenience. After 79 days, Coca-Cola folded.
I believe that they have heard us, and what we did was to mobilize the consumers of the Coca-Cola company, and they were heard, and their protest was loud and clear, and so Coca-Cola company has responded in a very efficient and good way.
The original Coke returned to market as Coca-Cola Classic. New Coke, later Coke 2, fizzed a while longer before fizzling in 2002. It is at least arguable that Coca-Cola would have caused just as much fuss if they said they'd changed the taste but hadn't, or that they'd have caused no fuss at all if they had changed it but didn't tell anyone. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Lynne O'Donnell. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.